John Garcia, I hope you're having a great afternoon. Welcome into the game in Tuscaloosa, Alabama.
What in the world you got going on over there, Ryan?
I don't know. It's the off season, and we're talking about linebackers, but we really haven't even mentioned linebackers in the first 20 minutes of the show.
Well, that's good. That's a good start. It means you're going to have a creative day.
Yeah, I think so. We got talking about, and I know it's never happened to you, man. You make radio appearances all over the country. And I was explaining a story that I was about to go on with our buddy, our mutual friend up in Huntsville, Drew D. Armand, and my cell phone, I literally could hear the bumper music, and it went bam. I mean, literally like I got hit by Reuben Foster coming across the middle of the field. I mean, it dropped, and I couldn't even get it back to make a phone call to tell him that my cell phone had dropped. It just, boom, it just went silent.
Isn't Wednesday their very special day of programming?
It was, and I don't know why I got invited. So I tried to spend 25 minutes talking about Auburn, but I didn't do a very good job. And I'm asking him for a mulligan where I can go back next Wednesday and do a much better job.
I think he's got your back. He'll get it done.
John, we have been talking about linebackers here, and the way you're a former college player. You've been a part of the recruiting process to watch a lot of these guys end up in Tuscaloosa. If I ask you to name 3 top linebackers in order, 1, 2, 3, that have played in the Nick Saban era, how would you define it? 3 linebackers that have played in Tuscaloosa under Nick Saban in this last 11 years, from your perspective, how would you go about doing that?
I mean, if we're just talking college, you think of the guys who were the most dominant on the best team. I think it starts there. Obviously, I mean, everybody who I'm sure has been thought of has at least 1 ring, if not 2. So it really doesn't filter the conversation very much. So you think of the guys who were signal callers, who were Defensive Player of the Year in the SEC type material, maybe an All-American, certainly All-SEC should probably be the initial criteria. I'm sure Rolando McClain got a lot of votes. And when you're talking about physically dominant, I don't know if there's been a better guy under Nick Saban at Alabama. So I think the conversation starts there. But as the game kind of opened up a little bit, and the responsibility of these linebackers actually increased for the guys who were good enough and athletic enough to stay on the field all 3 downs, I think the criteria really widens, and I think it kind of washes out some really good ones. I think, your Dante Hightowers of the world get washed out a little bit because they were so one-dimensional at the time when they played, in Tuscaloosa. So I think that brings in your C.J. Mosleys of the world. He would for sure be on that list, top 3, one of the most cerebral linebackers Nick has ever had, regardless of stop, and a true captain. I think there's so much to be said for physical ability, but that leadership, the ability to control a defense, adapt on the fly, things like that. We've only heard, top exemplary things about C.J. Mosley. So he'd be in there for me. And then the third one's really hard. Do you go Reuben Foster, pure raw ability, just the quickest guy from point A to point B, that of all these guys, I think, and one of the most violent upon contact? Or do you really play into the modern era, and maybe you go Rashaan Evans, the guy who I think when we look back, we'll say, man, that guy did a lot. That guy did a lot of things over the course of a lot of years to warrant his name in this conversation. So I think for the sake of timeliness and where the game is going, he might be the guy who did more than any other linebacker under Nick, whether it's rushing the passer, playing that traditional, inside linebacker, captain of the defense, if you will, playing on the outside, coverage, really the whole thing. Rashaan Evans is kind of he's the example for the new age, if you will, of what linebackers are now becoming, even though we still throw the classic, inside linebacker tag on his name. So that would probably be my 3, but there's a bevy of other candidates you can roll into, and a lot of those guys have obviously gone on to big things in the NFL, and a lot of them are still doing it.
John, let me go back from a player perspective. Help me understand Rashaan Evans coming out of high school and where you saw him just a couple of weeks ago get drafted in the first round by the Tennessee Titans.
It's so cool. I mean, the coolest part of what I do for sure, is seeing these kids and seeing them grow physically, mentally, the whole thing. Rashaan, when we first started scouting him, the off season going into his junior year at Auburn High School, of course, and he already was this jack of all trades. He was playing a ton of spots on offense, even quarterback, believe it or not, and successfully playing quarterback. He helped Auburn get to the state championship game one year. But on defense, I mean, it was so easy to like him. He was so explosive, and he was pretty big already. He added a lot of mass at Alabama, but I think it was more like fine tuning than necessarily going from 0 to 100. He was probably 6'3", 220 in high school, or maybe 6'2 and a half. We were probably a little generous there. But he did so many things already. Explosive on contact. He showed the ability to rush the passer, but just his pure physique and running ability, period, before you even really got into positions and things like that, were always standout marks with him. And then when Reuben Foster transferred to Auburn High School and they were playing together, now you really got to see Rashaan's versatility, because now you had a guy who you can just throw in the middle with Reuben and say, hey, seek and destroy, and we'll let Rashaan do it on the back end or on the outside or whatever. And that's when he started to really flash true pass rushing ability, to the point where I think at one time he was a defensive end in our projections. We thought that Alabama or wherever he ended up, they would add a bunch of weight on him and let him scream off the edge like a Tim Williams or et cetera. So that didn't happen. He just had too much. He had too much versatility to isolate into one position like that. So it was basically, the more you saw him, the more you liked him. And he capped it off in the best way possible. Under Armour All-America week, with a ridiculous amount of talent all over the field. And there was one play where me and Chad Simmons looked at each other and was like, okay, this evaluation is over. You know, he blitzes off the edge and he's going against Cam Robinson of all people. And he just lifted him and planted him into the ground on his way to the quarterback. So it was this ridiculously athletic, powerful, jaw-dropping play that we hadn't seen. Cam Robinson was as dominant of a high school, line prospect as we've seen in a long time. So for Rashaan to make him light work was truly one of the defining moments of Rashaan's evaluation and recruitment. For us, he jumped right into the top 10 and never left. He was the top player coming out of Alabama that year, and obviously did what he had to do in Tuscaloosa, in moving around and all of that, on his way to becoming a surefire first-round draft pick, and a guy who I think might be at the second level for the Titans for the next decade or so. It really wouldn't be a surprise.
John, I build respect, and not that I lose respect for players that leave, because I'm not in their situation. I'm not in their background. I don't know what what's depending on their success. But I look at a guy like Rashaan Evans for waiting his turn. And you think he was better? He would have got more playing time, get more experience, get more snaps. But he waited for the opportunity, and he was ready to take advantage of that. You see so many players, I don't know if they would have been as patient as waiting for their opportunity.
Yeah, and some of the guys who we now consider Alabama greats, they had to wait, especially at that linebacker spot. Your question at the beginning of the segment is one of the hardest questions to answer, because there have been so many darn good linebackers that a lot of these guys have had to wait, whether it's Reggie Ragland. Heck, Reuben Foster was like a special teams ace before he was ever, a surefire first rounder. So Rashaan was in that group as well. Definitely had to wait his turn, and I think had to learn how to just be a signal caller and an inside backer, something that maybe he'd never spent a lot of consecutive time at on his way to Alabama. So that's kind of the curse, if you will, of versatility, is actually, mastering one spot. So for him, it was even, you could argue, more difficult than the Reuben Fosters, Reggie Ragland, those guys having to sit and wait their turn. So you're right, though. In this culture, it's an instant gratification. We hear it all the time. We want it now. We want to see it now. We read the headline. We don't read the story itself, and we move on. So, that transcends into college football. And you see all these transfers. Now, some come much later than others, but more times than not, it's like a kid knows year one, year two. All right, I've seen enough of this place. They're not gonna play me, and they try to throw the blame elsewhere. But I think if you did talk to Rashaan, he would probably tell you, look, first of all, the guys in front of me, and second of all, that's what made me better. That's what made you ascend to a certain point. You hear a lot of these Bama greats talking about the competition, whether it's Julio Jones, Calvin Ridley, Minka Fitzpatrick, Derrick Henry, Najee Harris now. I mean, guys who have been as highly touted as can be, yet still had to wait in some capacity. That's what they crave. They crave that competition. It fueled them to be better, as to where it fueled other guys to look elsewhere, right or wrong. So Rashaan obviously was in the former category, and clearly it's paid off literally and figuratively now.
John, is Dylan Moses and Mack Wilson that next staple of linebackers that we've come to expect under Nick Saban?
Yeah, you talk about a guy who you cover his recruitment crazy. I mean, that Dylan Moses and Mack, they both had kind of crazy recruitment, long recruitments. They were identified pretty early on. Of course, Dylan Moses all the way back to middle school. So the fact that he's even panning out is amazing to me. But I think so. I think they're different than some of the guys that we've mentioned. But there's some similarities with a couple of guys as well. I think Mack, you talk about Mack, I mean, this is an athlete. This is a football player. The first thing that comes into my mind when I think of Mack Wilson isn't even necessarily linebacker play. It's just football. He's another guy like Rashaan in high school, quarterback, punter, receiver, running back, defensive back, linebacker, defensive end, kind of whatever his teams needed at the time. And he was pretty successful doing all of those things. So again, like we said with Rashaan, maybe you suffer for that at some point. But when he's got on the field, particularly, in this era, in the space era, defending the pass, Mack has made as many plays against, receivers and quarterbacks as any linebacker over the last few years. Interceptions, passes broken up, that should have been interceptions, things like that. So this is just an athlete who's growing into that role. With Dylan, it's been a little more conventional, a guy who played linebacker and running back a lot coming up because he was just the biggest, fastest, strongest guy on basically every team he's been on. But I think he's a little bit closer to that traditional mold of what we think of when we think of the Rolando McClain, Reggie Ragland, C.J. Mosley, that traditional kind of signal caller, captain, depend on me guy to do all the little things as well as all the big things that everybody talks about and that everybody can see. He'll be the guy who makes that stop on 4th and 1, but he'll also fit his gap the right way on the play you didn't see him make and things like that. So I think technically he's a little more ahead of where Mack is maybe at this point, and certainly where he was at this time as a freshman. So I think they're a little bit different, but you can see some similarities with some of these guys that we've talked about. And obviously that's a heck of a compliment, but that's what Nick Saban recruits, and that's what he wants in the middle of his defense. And those two guys will obviously be centerpieces here for 2018 and possibly beyond, especially with Moses.
We are talking to John Garcia _Jr, available there. Crimson and Blue Chips. You can find the big announcement that included. They're going to be on iTunes. You can subscribe there. Crimson and Blue Chips. They go deep into recruiting. They talk college football. Really dialed in the Crimson Tide. John, what is next when we talk about recruiting in that world that we live in, certainly with recruits and camps? I know spring training going on, a lot of high schools throughout this region. But what's next for a lot of these recruits?
Yeah, they're not taking as many visits right now, one, because the spring football at the college level is kind of behind us, and they're focusing on their own springs, particularly, in the South, Alabama, Georgia, Florida. These guys are playing spring football games. Even this weekend, there's a big slate of games in the state of Alabama that you'll probably see some Crimson Tide coaches pop up at. So that'll continue into next week for those other teams in the South. And then really it's about getting kids over to Tuscaloosa, because then we're going to see a new camp season this year, Ryan. The calendar has shifted, and there's a condensed period of time where it's not a dead period. So times that you can have kids on campuses. So into June, very, very much through the month of June, you'll see a lot of camps in a very short amount of time. And I'm talking all the camps: kicking camp, youth camp, middle school camp, women's camp, if there's an informational segment. So anything like that, you're going to see a lot of that here in the next few weeks as these schools compete to get a lot of kids on campus to perform and maybe help them decide on, hey, is this kid an offer kid or not? Is this kid number 1 on the board, number 2 on the board? Different things like that to separate kids on the board and make decisions on their turf, in their setting, coached by obviously Alabama coaches. So that's going to happen for everybody through the rest of May into June especially. All the camps will be concluded before the end of June runs out. So July will be much slower, much more dry compared to years past. So you'll still see this momentum Alabama kind of has right now on the trail. I think you'll still see it rolling here for the next few weeks, and that could obviously mean more commitments, more additions for what is right now the number one class in the country on 24/7 Sports.
You think they've got a chance to stay at number one?
Yeah, I think they've got a great chance, Ryan.
Okay.
They've got a strong group in state and the allotment of scholarships, things they didn't have last year. There's going to be more than 25 guys in this class, as to where this last class was, once you hit the 20 mark, you just didn't know how many more spots were going to be available. But this one will strongly be 25 plus. So that's going to keep Alabama aggressive, taking commitments early, and moving on, to the next guy on the board. So I think you'll see Alabama around number one basically the rest of the way through this 2019 cycle.